All right, everyone. Looks like we are ready to go. Give folks a couple of seconds to join. If you are already on the live stream, please share this link with your network. We want to get as many folks as possible to join us today and just enjoy this great conversation that we're going to have today. All right, y'all. So let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Enrique Guzman. I am the manager of social impact programs for the Prospanica Center for Social Justice. I'm here today introducing our very first webinar of our Intersectionality webinar series. Today, we are touching on the introduction of othering and belonging framework. We are going to dive into introductions real quick. I have a couple of administrative things that I just want to touch on with everyone here today. Again, please share the link. We want to get more folks here. I wanted to talk about real quick before we start. We are going to have some great conversations, some great perspectives in the room today. We have some amazing leaders joining us with very diverse backgrounds and identities. And I think that's definitely going to influence the dialogue that we are going to have today. So we want to aim to foster an inclusive dialogue, drawing from our varied experiences to explore these complexities that we often see. So with that in mind, I have put together some community agreements. I know that we are in a webinar platform, but for the folks that are viewing us today, we really hope that from today you engage in active listening from these very diverse perspectives, and truly have an openness to learning. There might be some concepts that you may be very aware of, and some that you're hearing about for the very first time, and that is totally okay. So we welcome you to just have an openness to learning and really assume some positive intent. We are here today to teach each other, to grow from each other, to just learn a lot more. And having that commitment to growth. I know that we may be sitting in discomfort based on some things that are shared. That's totally fine. That's totally fine. And as we self-reflect, tomorrow we're talking to our comadres and compadres about what we heard about. We really want to um, just channel that self-reflection and growth from our session today. So that is all you will hear from me. I am going to turn it over to our amazing host, to Richard, to continue on with our webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you, Enrique. It's wonderful to be with you all today. I'm really grateful to be in the audience here with some very expert minds on these topics. So I am my pronouns are he him, and I am based in Austin, Texas, and I work for a company called UKG. It's an HR software company. I'm part of the Belonging, Equity, and Impact team at that company, and I lead a supplier diversity program. I've been doing DEI work for the last 10 years. And I've done that both in corporate settings as well as I chair our DEI committee for my local chamber of commerce. So I have an opportunity to work with diverse-owned companies to drive some of these agendas forward. I have the grand privilege of being a part of the Prospanica Center for Social Justice Advisory Board, and I've had the privilege of being a part of that since its inception. What attracted me to being on the board from the beginning, and still attracts me today, is our mission of really trying to create safe space where we can have dialogue like we're going to have tonight, to talk about the situations that we face, the inequities that we all experience within our respective companies, within our communities, and take the opportunity to learn from each other. Since today's topic is surrounding, and then this webinar series is about intersectionality, I thought I would just briefly share some of my own intersectional identities for you to get to know me a little bit better. I am a cisgender heterosexual father of two college-age children. One of my children identifies as non-binary, and as a cis hetero dad, this has been a growing experience for me to, to accompany my non-binary child as they navigate, the queer experience within our family, within the Latina community, within this conservative state of Texas where we live, where frankly it's becoming much more restrictive and even dangerous for the LGBT community. Another aspect of my identity is I'm Mexican American, but I first identify as being Tejano. So for those that don't speak Spanish, that means Texan or Texican. And I identify that way because I have been in Texas for a long time. I'm a 11th generation San Antonio, Texas native. My family's been here since 1731. We have a family cemetery that goes way back. And it's a nuance of my identity that's extremely important. And so I bring that up just to say that oftentimes you'll hear labels that we're given. If I'm called Hispanic or Latino, it doesn't offend me. But at the same time, there is this important nuance of my identity that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle with those types of classifications. So I share those as just examples of things that make me who I am. I hope that we'll hear from our panelists as well as from some of you around who you are and how the world around you can sometimes create challenges or opportunities. So I'm going to ask you to please just lean in. Let's make this a great conversation. I'm now going to pass it to Dr. Laura Quiros to introduce herself, as she'll be moderating today's panel.
Thank you so much, Richard. I love holding space with you for many reasons, but also because I learn something new about you every time we're together. So really an honor to be here. And Enrique, I already I'm just so honored to hold space with you too. So thank you. From the Prospanica Center for Social Justice, we welcome you here tonight. I'm going to go quick through my own identities because we have some really amazing panelists with us to share and to talk about this very important topic of othering and belonging. So some of you may know me out there. My name is Laura Quiros, Laura Quiros. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a Black Latina who's also Jewish. So my dad, Puerto Rican, Venezuela. My mom, who passed away about 3 years ago, was white and Jewish from Eastern Europe, Poland. And so I occupy all of those identities. I do this work because I grew up in homes of racism and anti-Semitism and in communities of racism, anti-Semitism. And so this is not just the work that I do, it's who I am. It's a lived experience for all of us here today. I think I can say that. I am also a mother of 2 girls, 16 and 10. I have 2 stepkids, 20 and 13. I reside in Montclair, New Jersey, where I am not now. I'm actually away with my daughter on a soccer journey. But we also live on the land of the Lenape, and it's important for me to name the indigenous lands in which I work from and live from, because a lot of belonging and othering is about erasure, right? And so I work from a trauma-informed social justice lens. I am an associate professor at Montclair State University and have a pretty thriving consulting practice where I work with organizations on the work of belonging, in sincere inclusion and belonging, and learning how to practice equitably. So I have much more to say, but I'm not going to hold us up. And I'd love for Richard, would you just introduce our panelists, and then I'll start us off with the first few questions. So thank you. Is Richard frozen? I think he might be frozen. All right, so I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves because they can probably do a better job than we can. So either any one of you, please step in and share your intersectional identities or any of the way you want to jump in.
I can go ahead and start.
Yep, thank you. Sorry about that. Cut out.
That's okay. Sandra, go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Villacorta. I am currently a doctoral candidate at Mount St. Mary's University, and I reside in Los Angeles. And some of my identities is that I'm queer. I use she, they pronouns. I'm also from a Salvadorian background. I'm proudly raised by a single mother. And I identify as culturally Catholic, meaning like todavía me persino and everything, but there's still some like kind of clashes that I hold with that religion that I grew up with. I grew up also, my first language was Spanish, but then in growing up, I also used English and ASL in my home. I'm also first gen, so I'm majoring in clinical psychology and I'm graduating next year. And a lot of my work has to do with traditional gender roles. And so the dissertation I just defended had to do with the experiences of LGBTQ individuals that grew up with traditional gender roles of machismo and marianismo. And in my clinical work, I use a very intersectional and liberation informed lens, meaning that I put my client in the forefront and it's more of a collaborative process. And I work with varying intersections, including BIPOC, monolingual clients, trans clients, disabled clients. So I have a lot of knowledge as well and still gaining knowledge along the way.
Thank you so much. Who's next?
Gianevangelo, I believe you're next to introduce yourself. Is that correct?
Sure.
I was gonna wait. Until
everyone's
I go last.
very careful of like stepping back and not taking up too much space. So go ahead, and then go to Jose Richard.
Yes, no, that's true. I tend to go last. I just like hearing everyone else and be inspired. But I'll go. I don't mind. My name is Jad Evangelo Nasser. I go by he, a, lui, hua pronouns in all 5 languages that I speak. I was born and raised in Lebanon, and I have roots in Palestine and Haiti. So I come from 3 very powerful cultures. You can imagine how that is. And I've lived most of my life in Lebanon, worked for the Dubai and Saudi Arabian market, mostly for the Middle East, North African, European, and North American regions in cross-cultural and multicultural marketing. So I come from a wealth of global experience. And then I moved in 2016 to New York City, where I did my master's at Parsons, the New School. And that's where I developed my film, Once Upon a Color, that talks about global artists from multiple backgrounds and how they intersect with one another. And made me realize that the world is interconnected and narratives of interconnected and narratives of resilience are interconnected because of intersectionality. And that became a core statement of my work. Intersectionality is the core statement of my work. That's why I consider myself a global inclusion and cross-cultural strategist within my own agency. I also do DI consulting and practice with the Center for Civil Rights here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm a college professor. I teach at 5 colleges, including Morris Brown and University of West Virginia, University of North Texas, and South College. And I design curriculums around those topics of multicultural education, global learning, cross-culturalism, intersectionality, as well as doing public talks and keynotes around those topics. I also identify as queer, and I've been diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia, but I never really talked about it because I thought they weren't real until I came to the US and I realized I should really be understanding those parts of my identity. And for me, I always like to trace back the study of intersectionality to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in her TED Talk, and understanding that that is the basis of the experience of the mistreatment of Black women in America foremost, and then adopting that ideology and understanding how does that intersect with countries of the world and other people from different intersections. How do we view intersectionality as a power, but also as a means of connecting with other individuals, understanding cross-cultural differences and cross-cultural connections. My work is very radical, academic, critical, research-based, and empathetic. And I believe that all perspectives need to be heard, and disagreement is necessary for discomfort, but eventually it should be constructive for having a sense of justice within our communities.
Wonderful. You do so much work. Thank you so much for all of that.
What an impressive panel that we have, and I think we should definitely jump into these topics. Richard, we're going to pass it to you now to kind of open up the floor on the conversation and get us started. So please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll do the intro and the content setting right away. My name is Jose Richard Aviles. I use they them pronouns. Another intersectional identity that I love a lot that we don't talk about often. I think it's maybe a very Mexican word, but to see different tocayos. And so with Richard being our moderator, that's a tocayo, and it's always fun. I love that word. And basically, it's that word that when you share a name with someone, that's your homie, that's your kin. Like, you don't want to call like someone else your name, so you just say tocayo. And so that's kind of cool. Academically, I think Doctora Laura is also my tocaya. I'm also a social worker. I'm an MSW and urban planner, so I work at the intersection of trauma and place. Um, Again, so my background a little bit, just I'm from Los Angeles, from originally Chumash Nation from South Central, so I'm a hood baby. Currently living in La Ciudad de Mexico. I'm out here writing a book of poems all about the topic of belonging and othering from like the Mexican and inverse migration story. But I'm also bicultural. I'm what I call a putaco, mitad pupusa, mitad taco, pero siempre pu. You can finish the rest. I'm a comedian, so listen, I don't like professionalism. It's a construct of white supremacy, so aquí vamos a echar relajo. But I'm also half Salvadorian and half Mexican. I am an urban planner, particularly work in transportation for a place called the Othering and Belonging Institute. So very fitting to be a part of the conversation. We are housed at UC Berkeley. And so what I'm going to do now in the next slide is share a little bit about how we talk about the process of othering and what belonging is, and then we'll talk about what that looks like. Now, the first one that we all kind of seem to know when we talk about lived experiences is othering. That's the icky feeling that we know that lives in our body. That's the one that we know that we constantly hear all these names, and we have, in some ways, in the name of belonging, try to reclaim some of these othering terms, right? They look different for many communities. But again, othering is a process of marginalizing individuals or groups perceived on differences. And now we all have differences, and the process of differentiation and the process of categorization is very innate to the human experience. It's that carnal thing that we still have. It's how babies develop their understanding of the world through human development process. But a lot of the times, othering captures basically the prejudices and the persistent marginality that can either happen, not either, but can happen in one of the above: race, gender, sexuality, religion, income, and disability in other forms, for sure. And then the process of belonging is, we start at othering because it feels like it's the one in which this country and this imperial state has been based on. So we know that language very, very well. The process of belonging is where the real work happens. And that's where we create inclusive environments where all individuals feel valued and included. Belonging entails having a voice and the opportunity to use it to make demands upon society and political institutions. So it's more than just having access. When we talk about access, we are talking about the realm of equality, right? It's kind of where we started, that everyone has equal access. Equity, understanding that not everyone starts at the equal access, but we move beyond equity to get to belonging, where everyone has sort of different, and I'll talk about this in our strategies, but when we have different baselines to what it is that we're going after, but then being able to make to co-create decisions and structures that shape community. In addition to when we talk about belonging at the Othering and Belonging Institute, we talk about some of the pillars of belonging, which is connection, recognition, and agency. So I'll go on to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit some of the key strategies. Now, so we want to talk about where can belonging actually occur, going back to what we talked about in structures. So structures is just also a really nice way of saying institutions. Definitely institutions, the state, if you want to call it that. Listen, we can go from like hella cute and hella radical. We embody all of the above. So some of those structures can look like educational institutions, the workplace environment, communities, and also in families. I think a very beautiful example, one of the strategies that we use is called bridging. So a lot of the times I'm gonna use the example, sorry, Tocayo, I'm gonna put you on the spot, but not so much on the spot, but I really appreciated this. I feel like after this webinar, I'm like, can you be my padrino? Like the story that you shared about your non-binary child and having to have the bridging conversation, right? That what you talked about is bridging. And sometimes that happens a lot within our families. Bridging within our families is the longest, the most tedious, yet the most rewarding work. And the reason why that happens is because there's already a sense of connection, right? And the example that Richard mentioned, and please, I'm just kind of going off what I've known and drawing the connection, but if I say anything out of place, please let me know. But in those conversations, right, there is the connection that we are family. And what bridging is asking us to do is to recognize each other in the conversation. Beyond this being a non-binary child, this is also a prime, a sobrine, a tía, you know, all of those things come into place. And I'm using the E, the tía, the prime, not the X, just because the X is a construct of American academia. And in Latin America, the E is used more commonly. It's all phonetically correct. I'm like, what you want me to call somebody like a amiguekis? Like, that's not like, don't get me started on, that's another webinar. But bridging is the conversation and strategy that we use in order to find the connection and recognition across different places. So that could look around policy, right? A lot of the times, for example, I'm an urban planner. So we're talking about affordable housing. A lot of the times we'll think about how do we have conversations of bridging between renters and developers. Those are two different parties who have a sense of belonging that's very different, right? Like a renter might feel like they belong to the community capital, and a developer might feel that they belong to the monetary capital. So a lot of the times it's thinking, how do we create those bridging conversations? Now, here's something to keep in mind. I definitely am on the more radical side of belonging, and yes, I talk about bridging, but the directionality of the bridge is important. I'm not asking renters to bridge towards developers. I'm asking developers to bridge towards the renters. Why? Because there's always going to be a power differential. So understanding that power differential is very important. And so another strategy that we talk about, oh yeah, foster dialogue, bridging. There's also another strategy that we use called targeted universalism. And targeted universalism is one of my favorite strategies that we use. But basically, that can be broken down in two parts. The universalism part is in setting a universal goal that we all can agree upon. Education should be free. That's a universal goal. Free education for everybody. Now, the targeted goes back to that power differential. We also have to understand that historically, the power to get or the access to education looks very, very differently. Now, let's be mindful that these strategies can also be weaponized to do harm. What do I mean by that, right? The erasure and the of affirmative action was a targeted universalist strategy. The goal could be that we all have access to education, but we're going to target certain people not to have it. So it can go either way. But again, targeted universalism sets a universal example that then says, based on these power differentials, we have to have targeted strategies to get people to that universal goal, right? Like someone who has a fifth generation college graduate has a very different access than someone who is first gen. So just some of the definitions, examples to throw it out there to get it started.
Thank you so much. There was so much there. And I hope our audience has a pen and paper next to them or a phone or something, because you covered so many important items on there. So I want people not to feel overwhelmed. We will share these definitions with you at some point, but really thank you for that grounding in beginning. And so let's get concrete here. Let's really talk to our audience about what this concept of othering, right? We have the definition. We may have had some personal experiences around it, but I'd like for us to get concrete. And my first question is I'd like examples of how othering manifests itself in our community, our meaning, however you define that, right? Past, present. Let's give people some examples of what that looks like. So you all know your questions that you're going to answer. So just step right in, unmute and come to the table with us.
One thing that comes to mind immediately is colorism. Individuals being treated differently because of the color of their skin, often meeting macroaggressions, microaggressions, and how, again, that's connected to other isms and structural oppression systems, right? And so I think sometimes what happens is within families, it's kind of disregarded or just kind of made a joke. Something I'm thinking about is like, oh, you're the adopted child, right? Because you're darker than the rest of the family. And again, how othering starts to manifest in that environment and how it continues into social environments. And again, there's this now expectation of I'm going to be treated differently because of the color of my skin. And it just has so many domino effects when we're talking about mental health issues, the lack of self-esteem, this tendency to isolate oneself because of that expectation of rejection. And, now speaking of my own intersections and my experiences of not only myself, but my clients is this othering of being queer, LGBT, right? And I think it's sometimes difficult because when we're speaking about certain religions and how often that's used to reinforce that, oh, what you're doing is wrong, right? Rather than really understanding that it's not necessarily that the person is wrong, is that these messages that are supposed to connect us, right? They're supposed to unite us. They're supposed to give us faith and hope for the future are actually being used to shame others, right? And so in my dissertation that I discussed, right, that looked at the experiences of machismo and marinismo with this intersection of being queer and being Latina, I found that I think 6 out of my 7 participants had some form of religious trauma that they recounted to me, and it was interesting because it's not that these people or these individuals didn't want a connection to a higher power or God. It's just that they didn't feel welcome in these spaces. So it's really interesting to see how othering again kind of blocks that connection or those bridges, as Richard was talking about.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd like to add to that as well. I mean, Sandra, you talked about colorism, which, I like to go there too. Honestly, it exists in all of our communities of culture, to be honest. And for me, othering looks like exclusion, to be honest. Not just like putting someone saying that they're different. It's just more that they don't belong here, or they're not of the standard of our traditional norms that we are grown up in. And for someone like me who grew up in a Middle Eastern household, but also, has intersection with the Caribbean communities, has proximity to Latinidad communities, and has friends who are African, and has a lot of friends who are Black American. So being immersed in multiple communities, I see a pattern of othering, and keep it straight. And as much as we like to amplify our communities as being collective, there's a lot of divide that happens in our communities that we need to make sure we address them without harming our communities. The collective power is there and is very powerful, but also collective power doesn't mean anything if othering exists. So, the idea of othering, for example, Afro-Latinidad identities from Latin communities is an example of that. Excluding LGBTQ identifying Arabs in Arab communities is also another part of it. Excluding people who identify with different genders or being gender fluid from certain communities is also another part of it. Or someone who is not Muslim, for example, in all Muslim households. You know what I mean? Like the exclusion given gender, given religion, like, oh, you're Lebanese, but you're not really Lebanese, is something that I've heard a lot growing up. Even in my own family, sometimes, my brother is lighter skinned, right? I got teased on as a kid, people told me you have, big lips like Black people. My brother never received those comments. We come from the same blood, literally, like the same mom and dad, but I get to receive those comments of being the adopted child, and he does not, because of colorist reasons, right? And then you come to the US and you find those similarities happening in different ways. Body size is another type of exclusion as well. You don't fit the body standard of what we look like here in this queer community. And I will say it even in our LGBTQ community, sometimes the standard of commercialization is very much, white assimilating, athletic body, able-bodied looking that you see in commercials. And I'm sitting here, but that's not really a representation of what queerness is, at least from my friend group, for those who have disabilities, those who are plus size, those who are differently abled, and these should be the representation of what queerness looks like, right? So It was those small nuances that exclude people from the standard of tradition. So that's how I see othering. The standard of tradition within our communities needs to be challenged. And we need to educate those who remain in that traditionalism that in order for you to grow collectively and powerfully, you need to include and empower the different intersectional identities so our cultures can come to the forefront. Otherwise, we're going to be on the back end.
You know, you said so many important things, and one of the like I'm thinking of many things, but I think it's so easy for us as a collective community to say I've been othered from a different culture, right? Or in a different space, but it's hard for us to look at ourselves and see that we've been othering within our own communities, right? Within our own kind. And I find that there's a resistance to that. People are always looking outside, they're not looking within. And so I really want us to pay attention to that. How are we causing othering within the same people that we are supposed to have community with, have love with, have familia with, right? And the other phrase you mentioned, which is incredibly important as well, I think both of you touched on this, and I wrote it down as this standard of tradition, right? We know, like I work in this field, and there's diversity in generation, right? Even in labels, right? Latina, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, right? Like some people are really wedded to certain labels. And I think a lot of that has to do with these standards of tradition and has to do with generations, right? And so I want to stay with that standard of tradition. And Sandra, you mentioned also the machismo and marinismo, and I'd like us to unpack that a little and talk about how that, you know, those sort of one example is these traditional gender roles, but other standards of tradition that contribute. And, you know, I always say like intention impact, right? Somebody can be a really loving, amazing person and also cause harm and also have poor impact. That doesn't make the person a bad person. And so I think I'd love for us to talk more about how these traditional gender roles lead to othering and prohibit this sense of belonging and this, I love this, Richard, this power to co-create, you know, within structures, right? Traditionality stops that. So I would love for us to unpack that a little. Any one of you.
I'll add to that. I think interestingly enough, right now, because I am living in Mexico City through this sabbatical from LA, I just needed to get away from LA for a little bit. But through what the interesting thing has been here, there is a very prime example here. Currently, we are in the season of La Casa de los Famosos Mexico, which is basically Big Brother, but the Mexican version. And during season one, Wendy Guevara, who is a social media influencer and a trans woman, became the first trans woman to be on openly broadcasted TV in Mexico, and she won the reality. And the reason that she won the reality is because she's not politically correct. She was like, I'm not going to be a martyr for the trans community. Like, listen, I am a woman with a penis, and that's how she calls herself. And she very much is, I'm a trans woman. But she also talked a lot about the fact that majority of the people in this country, and in this country, I mean Mexico, live in extreme poverty. And so people connected with her along her stories of poverty that saw beyond the trans identity. Now, I bring that up because I think she is a perfect example of that sort of compassion that we're talking about when we are able to, one, understand just differences because they exist. But rather than doing this active othering, and again, it's not that it's perfect. People still saying some fucked up things, but there is a bridging that is slowly starting to get built where now she has become unintentionally, and that's not what she does, but she has opened the door for a lot of trans women in Mexico. Through media, there's a lot of work that still needs to happen. There's still a lot of transphobia and a lot of femphobia, and violence against women is very normalized in Mexico to the point that it's the punchline of a joke. I think that's the nuance of a generational othering, that it becomes so normalized that we do it in a way that we don't even acknowledge it, that we are products of it.
Yes.
But even in that, to your question, Laura, right? When we're able to see the ways in which slowly we chip away at the, oh, sorry, I like backed up and then like, sorry. When we chip away at the traditional role and we allow it to shift, you begin to see new traditions, you're able to see new cultures come arise. I mean, Wendy has created a whole vocabulary, and there's a whole different slang here around queerness in Mexico City that has become so much more a part of the everyday lexicon, which is exciting. So I think in the ability to chip away at tradition, and it also reframing, because in a lot of spaces, particularly here in Mexico, like the Musha community, like they have always been a part of the tradition, and have always been at the center of gender fluidity and queerness in Mexican culture. But again, we get into the different isms and all that stuff. And it's, I think, in addition to not also breaking away tradition, reimagining and reframing tradition. You know what I mean? Like, if there's anything that I think about for me as someone who grew up celebrating Dia de los Muertos, like my altars were always a part of my family. It's what we have always done pre-Coco, y'all, pre-Coco. But we always built these altars, and now it's been beautiful to have conversations with my family to add trans ancestors who might have passed away to the altar. Or now we get to have conversations about ancestors. Like I have an aunt who passed away when she was 15, and we stopped mentioning her name. And it was like, well, why was it so easy for us to dispose of a young woman? Why did we forget her name? So now I've made it a tradition to say, no, but we got to talk about Tia Ana. And yes, y'all might not remember, but she's one of us. And so there's that beautiful thing that begins to happen where we begin to reframe tradition to include new traditions. And again, that's through processes like bridging and the conversations. But I think of, I don't know, when you mentioned that, Wendy came to mind as someone who is setting before and after in Mexican media around trans women's issues.
And I think, just to name, and then I'd love to hear from the two of you, but this shifting away is scary for people. I want to name that. It's not easy. Like, while we may see the shifting away as an opportunity for growth, for joy, for integration, other people, particularly I think traditional leaders, right? Because that's who we're talking to, see that shifting away as a loss, right? Or as something being taken away from them. And so that can be really scary, and that can be really unsettling. So I just want to name that too. And Jad, Evangelo, or Sandra, do you want to speak to sort of any of the things that Richard just named?
I can definitely add on to this conversation about gender roles and how that can affect othering and belonging, right? It's very complex, it's very nuanced, and it's very unique to each person, that every person is going to experience these traditional roles very differently, and kind of speaking from personal experience, it was definitely a process of redefining what these meant for me, that I do want to sacrifice for my family, but not be a martyr, right? I want to show up. I am loyal. I am going to be there if you need me to pick you up at 3 a.m. because something crazy is going on. But at the same time, I'm going to have boundaries. I'm going to learn to say no, or I can help you later, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently selfish about that taking care of me is how I show up for community. It's how I show up for family members. And I think sometimes it is scary when, you hear your first no, as maybe as a parent, right? Or as a family member, when we've been taught that's a bad thing to say. I think also going to our collectivistic culture, we are, again, so loyal to our family, and that can be very much a strength, right? Because it can speak to why we need to have these uncomfortable conversations of othering and do the actual critical work to make inclusive spaces, right? Because part of it is having these conversations of, this hurt me, or this harmed me in a way, or this is harming our community. And we need to kind of pivot and shift and see, how is it that I don't think we're maybe necessarily stepping away from tradition, but we're expanding our ways, right? That we're allowing people that they can be traditional, but just kind of question, like, is what we're practicing causing harm, right? I think that's what we need to kind of ask ourselves when we're kind of creating these new definitions as well. And so let me see, there was something else I wanted to bring up. Oh, Richard, you brought up Oaxaca and the mujeres, and in one of my interviews, because I did a qualitative studies, meaning I did a lot of kind of rich description. It was interviews, and it was very deep in the conversation. It almost felt like a therapeutic session that I was having with my participants. And we talked about how their family members were able to expand. They were able to grow, how they were able to kind of lean towards acceptance just a little bit, right? And there was a queer, I believe they were pansexual Oaxacan participant, and they talked about having a very machista dad growing up, being very limited because they were a woman growing up, and now they're identify as more gender fluid. And there was just a lot of clash going on. And what helped them, interestingly enough, is I believe right before COVID occurred, they started working at a very popular gay bar here in Los Angeles. And that exposed them, I think similarly to like Casa de los Famosos, a person. It was like a humanization process of this person is not my enemy. This person is not evil. They're not inherently bad. They're just like me. You know, they just have this different intersection of maybe I don't have a full understanding of, but you know, later on they were telling me how their dad was bringing this person over to the house, and just, you know, the shock this brought to my participant of never in a million years did I think my dad was going to bring this very feminine gay, you know, male into the home and be so accepting, right? So there is hope and true change that can happen, but it is very long and tedious work that happens within our communities as well.
I'm just laughing because I was gonna say, you know, you're doing the work when you're like parents who were a little bit homophobic before now trying to hook you up with somebody. You're like, oh damn, okay, okay.
Yeah, I don't mind taking it a step further, more in terms of like best practices.
Yeah, that's where I was going
right?
next. So you read my mind.
Right. I mean, because, you know, we're hearing like a lot of like, you know, personal experiences from both Richard and Sandra. So I'm like, I think this is important to mention the duality of best practices for people like us who want to do the work and consult companies on how to break from tradition and move forward, honestly. And I want to take it back to a concept of who is our original oppressor, if you think about it, because we're thrown into this world and we think white supremacy is our one and only oppressor. Well, it is the main one for sure. But if you think about it, our families are our original number one oppressors, you know, and even if we love them, we have great relationships with them and everything. But growing up in certain cultural families can be oppressive, and we have to face them, and we have to train ourselves. We don't realize, but we do train ourselves to face our older brothers, our uncles, our aunties, our mom, our dad, you know, trying to defend ourselves. And they're trying to tame us down because they want us to remain within certain things. And I'm pretty sure from three queer identifying folks here, you can resonate with what I'm saying, you know, and that becomes a practice when you grow up. As you're growing up, you are constantly, day by day, small things, certain comments, you know, you go to school, you come back, you are facing oppressive individuals, right? But at the same time, this is your community. So we are in, I don't want to say a battle, but in a challenge of, you know, trying to educate without realizing that this is who we are, right? But we can't be who we are because you're not allowing us to be who we are, because we love you. And I want you to love me for who I am, but I also want to be me, right? So it's very, very, very sensitive because some people can't break out of that. And what happens is a lot of pressure, a person disengages and then leaves their family and leaves their tradition, and they become anti their original culture. So they don't want to do that. And that maybe has happened with a few of us. It happened with me for a while, but then I realized, how do I come back? So I left Lebanon. You know, I had to face many, you know, challenges. I went to the States. was very liberated, and then learned a lot of things. And when I started visiting once every 2 years and coming back, the more I showed the work that I do, the more my parents were like, wow, what do you do? And they're like, maybe there's an opportunity to teach the tradition how to change. And then when they start realizing how we are changing and making change within our communities, they want to learn more. So we educate them. They say questions that are ignorant. We educate them, and we start finding common grounds. And then there's relationships. And then eventually the relationship becomes a sense of like a common ground where they're changing, or they're changing because they've seen our change. How can that be adapted in companies who are being a little bit oppressive with their methods, anti-DEI, anti-equity and all of that? How do we show up without disengaging completely and seeing how we can come to common grounds, but slowly trying to ignite that fire in them so they can change a little bit? So that is naturally happening. At the end of the day, if a company is anti-completely everything that we are, we don't need to be there completely. And they can work it out on their own. But if companies are struggling because they want us to be included, but they don't want to include us because they're scared, right? How do we manage around that? So let's look back into our lived experiences. Who do we have to face first? Okay, we faced, greater battles. So how can we face this one? How can we challenge to, change oppressive methods and educate people on our inclusion here matters for the greater good. It's great for you to learn and to advance your knowledge and to break out of tradition, or as someone said on the panel, reform the tradition, reforming it, right? So I just want to show that duality, just to showcase to everyone that our lived experience is our training, was our training without us even realizing it. And it's far beyond any DEI certificate, any master's in DEI, any experience that you would have having a VP of DEI in whatnot company, because the lived experience that we've had is literally the degree that we hold forever, that no one can take away from us, because it trained us to have these tools to face, oppressive or traditional methods. And I hope that makes sense.
It makes total sense. I think, Richard, you can identify this. I tell my social work students that you are your greatest tool. You may look at all these interventions and all these ways of intervening with the client, but ultimately, as you said, you are your greatest tool, right? So, and within that is a level of self-preservation too. So as we move to sort of the top of the hour, I just want us to make sure that we sort of share other best practices, or even ways that people can advocate in their organizations for more inclusion, for more belonging. I know one of that is self-preservation, right? Really understanding the environment you're in and learning how to protect yourself, because the truth is we can't always bring our sincere selves to work, right? And so how do we hold that as a place of acceptance and strategy and preserve ourselves? So just throwing that out there for us. And what else? What else can we share with our audience around best practices, around advocacy, around anything else that you think would be helpful as we start to kind of conclude tonight? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would add, lean into the transformation. A lot of the times I think there is this misconception that representation is diversity, equity, and inclusion. But again, so when we talked about belonging, it's not just about having that access, but having the ability to co-create and influence, which is not, so it's not just like, let me put on a Pride Month because it's June. No, like really allow yourself to be transformed. I think a lot of the conversations that we've been having involve some sort of self-transformation. Now, that is also very hard. Know that when you're trying to also include people from identities or like from marginal identities, and that could be across many different places, sometimes the pushback may just be trauma responses. And that's a whole other conversation and topic. I don't believe in the trauma bonding. I believe in the healing bonding. Like, let me be a manifestation of my healing and bond over that. We can recognize each other over our trauma, but let's bond in the healing. Don't get me started on influencers and all that to do, but I think that's important. Also being compassionate. Sometimes we're going to cross boundaries and we don't realize they're boundaries until they're crossed. That's why they're called boundaries, because we didn't know that before. So being mindful and compassionate, not only to the self, but also to someone who might say, girl, you just crossed my boundary and we're not going to kiki in that way. yes, you can call me girlfriend, but I'm not going to invite you to my open mic because I'm going to talk shit about you. So it's a boundary. But I think it's also important to have that boundary, to be compassionate and to be willing to transform, because that's what we're asking for. We're asking not just for the representation, but rather for the transformation. Also being mindful of cancel culture.
Yes.
I am not a fan of cancel culture. I think as someone who's been organizing since I was 15, like, girl, in the queer ages, I'm a tia. Look, I've been out for a long time. So in my 30s, I'm a tia. Folks are coming out at 27. I was like, girl, that was me at 10. Like, no. But as a tia in the work, I'm not going to cancel my mother for using he, him pronouns when I know that every time she got masks during pandemic, she gave me all the floral ones. So in the same way that no one taught me to be a queer body, no one taught my mother to be a queer parent. And so understanding that, my tocayo's like, yeah, let's see, I see that I got one for you too. But I think it's also important to like be mindful of the cancel culture, because we live in a society now that is so quick to just get to the council that we don't allow for the bridging to happen. These are uncomfortable conversations, but if you build that initial connection, it may be the love for pupusas or the love of taco that all of a sudden you're sitting with someone who's different from you, and building that relationship can then get us to help us understand each other. Because that's what we're trying to get to. I think, as mentioned before, like understanding that we're all being oppressed by the same folks, y'all. And we need each other now more than ever. So it's important for us to build those relationships. So I invite that. And then the last thing I'll share is know your own. If you are the one on the marginal side of the thing, the knowing your identities, build relationships and networks. It may not even be within your own place of work, but it may be across fields. You may know other social workers, other therapists, or other planners. I'm just mentioning those so that's what's here on the panel. But definitely taking care of each other is important, because this work is very tedious, and we don't talk enough about the secondary trauma of being the teachers of folks who want to do more DEI work, and we end up being the teachers. So yes to the lived experience, in addition to the self-preservation, and like don't give away all the secrets. That's it.
Thank you.
Just some final comments to best practices. I think this is my therapist side coming out, but I think it's so easy to be reactionary when it comes to, people having differences of opinion, or, just different upbringing, And so I think, as my colleagues were touching on, it is about having these comfortable conversations, but creating safety in that. Creating a place where there isn't shame, or there isn't like this back and forth, right? That it can be, I grew up with, being taught X, Y, Z, and now I'm having this, very confused reaction to what I'm learning, and just kind of naming it what it is, so that we can have these raw and much needed conversations, but in a space that is going to be productive. I think that's what I'm looking for. Change and growth is scary. It's really uncomfortable. And I think we also have to name that too, that, transformation, as beautiful and as rewarding as it is, the work to get there is very difficult. And so that's why it's so important to lean into community and our strengths as a culture, right? That we are collectivistic, that we are going to hold each other along the way, even if we have questions, right? And so I think along recognizing our intersections is recognizing our privileges. Like, now that I have this degree, or soon will have it, really recognizing that I can use this for my advocacy work. And yes, there are still times where I'm kind of, wary of using my voice, and especially when sometimes you feel like you're the only one in the room with a certain lived experience, right? But either way, it's so important for us to take up space and represent, because that is also what brings up true change, right? We can't just kind of sit back and then, have all these uncomfortable feelings, but we're not saying anything because we're afraid, of retaliation, of being othered, right, in the workplace, right, what have you. But it's so important to call out people respectfully.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. we call it more calling in as well, like, in
Calling
our stuff,
in,
like calling
yes.
them in for the discussion.
I
And I'll
like
add to that, my final thought is actually similar to Sandra's, but decentering yourself. It's
Mhm.
really important. Everybody wants to have the spotlight, like everybody wants to be a celebrity, everybody wants to be seen for the work that they do, to be honest. It's not everybody, but a lot of people do. This work is about the work itself. It's not about us. We utilize our positionality to enhance the narrative, and our narratives are valid, and that's important. I will always talk about my intersectionalities and my narrative, but at the end of the day, I just want to protect my communities, right? What I really want to happen is for Black trans women not to be killed by the police or by, misogynists or anything. That's what I really want to happen. And I'm not a Black trans woman at all. But why do I want to advocate for that and make sure that happens? Is because we need to protect our communities. The work that we do is more for protection and amplification, right? So we utilize ourselves as points of access and positionalities. We all have privileges and disadvantages in different contexts. We need to be aware of that. So decentering ourselves and then letting the narrative flow and utilizing our point of positionality to get the work forward. And you have to really understand, well, why am I doing this? I personally, I love it. Like, it brings me passion. I just have a passion of doing this because this world is messed up, and I like I like when I see people finding their own liberation. So that's my why, the reason why. So people should realize, why do you do the work? Because if you're doing it for the money, great, just admit it, right? And we'll see how the work is doing and if it's working for you, right? People never want to admit the real reason why they want to get into equity work, but really reflect on, well, why are you doing this work in the first place, right? So admitting that, you really have to admit that. And the other thing is, I'll tell everyone, please take moments to escape into your liberation. For me, it's traveling abroad. Like, when I see shit coming down in America, sometimes I'm just like, okay, here I'm booking a trip to Trinidad. Goodbye for 1 week. Let me go immerse myself in another community, learn, explore, visualize, immerse myself, learn a language, try new food, be there, understanding and decentering myself, and come back to refresh so I can bring new learning and like come with a different mindset. So, what is your escape to liberation, right? Find that, hone in on it, and take breaks for that. You need it, right? This is very personal work. So, what is your liberation activity that you like to do? And please go ahead and do it.
Yeah. So I want to deeply thank you all so much. We could have this conversation for so much longer. I'm sure all of us here hold space in person for people. And my question is always, so what are you leaving with, right? When we're in a virtual space, I say, when you click leave meeting, how has this session changed you, even if it is in the littlest way, right? So I hope that you have been taking notes. I hope you have more questions than answers. This is the first of many webinars that we will bring to you. We are very excited by all there is to come, but in this moment, what are you leaving with? If you could just take a moment of quiet reflection before you go back to whatever else you're entering into, I think we would love that, as you might love that too. So, Richard Lopez, thank you for being a co-host. I don't know if you want to say any final words before we hand it back to Enrique.
I would just like to thank everyone who participated today. I personally learned a ton. I've got 2 pages of notes I can't wait to go back and read through. Thank you to the panelists. My goodness, just wealth of knowledge, and whew. And to my tocayo, and you had me laughing. I love it.
Yeah, and just Enrique, just before you sign us off, there's many people behind the scenes that have made this happen. So just also want to give a special shout out to Esther, who has really got us together and got us going in this. So I know she is watching, and just sending love and gratitude to her as well. So Enrique, go ahead.
Thanks, everyone. Well, yes, us, big surprise. I am back, despite saying that I was not going to be back. But I do want to highlight real quick our next webinar, which will take place on August the 21st. I have placed the QR code for the LinkedIn registration. We are going to have some amazing panelists that day as well. So please, please, if you are excited like me to learn again much more like I did today, please, please, please register for the event. One last time, I would like to give a virtual round of applause and an amazing thank you, muchos abrazos, to our panelists today, to our hosts today. This has been amazing work. If you didn't take notes, it's okay. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So again, you can share it with your entire network, and jot down some notes as you rewatch the webinar, because this has been amazing. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your time, and have a great evening. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Bye, y'all.